Welcome to the concluding session of the India-Switzerland Language and Diversity Dialogues. In our last session, we spoke to Alexandra Meen and Shehnaz Bashir about their personal experiences, literary works, and journalistic reportage, navigating questions about belonging, memory, and identity. Pro Helvetia, New Delhi, is a part of the Swiss Arts Council's worldwide network of liaison offices. PHND supports and disseminates Swiss arts and culture in South Asia. It promotes cultural exchange, develops and nurtures long-term partnerships, initiates co-productions, and supports residencies. Belong is a platform to promote diversity and inclusion in India through the use of arts, literature, and community building. The platform also hosts the Belong Literature Festival, regular book readings and events, and are also producing short format content focused on the themes of feminism, gender, sexuality, caste, race, faith, and disability. So today we have two wonderful authors and translators joining us. I'd like to give you a little bit of an introduction about them before we invite them to talk a little bit about their work themselves. So let's start with Prisca Augstoni. Prisca Augustoni is the author of books like Animal Extreme and Hora Zero. She was born in 1975. She's a poet, narrator, translator, and essayist. She teaches comparative literature at the Federal University of Juiz de Fora. She also writes in Italian and French. In 2014, she published the short story book Cosa Resta del Bianco, and in 2015, the collection of poem Un ciel provisoire. I'm sorry if I'm getting the pronunciation wrong. And now we're going to introduce Arunawa Sinha. Arunawa Sinha translates Bengali literature into English and English and other literatures into Bengali. Over 60 of his translations have been published so far. His translations have won several awards in India and have been shortlisted for a number of international awards. He teaches creative writing and translation at Ashoka University and is the books editor at Scroll.in. A very warm welcome to both Arunawa and Prisca. Really looking forward to the conversation we're going to be having today. So I think before we begin, may I invite Prisca to tell us a little bit more about her work, her wide, expansive work. I mean, the bio obviously did not do it justice. So Prisca, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the central themes about your work, what drives it, and what it is like writing across genres, formats, and languages.
Okay, thank you, Swati. I'm very happy to be here with you, sharing these discussions and these ideas. I'm very pleased to be here. Well, since the beginning of my work, some themes concern me more than others. One main theme is migration, I mean, physically and symbolic migration, crossing boundaries. As I was born in a region full of mountains, and in some ways built by a rural vision of life. I mean, my region where I was born. There are many Swiss people all around the world that in the past century were obliged to migrate in order to find better condition of life, as today many other people all around the world do it. And there are many people nowadays, we know it, it's just a question of opening the newspapers that migrate, often in very dangerous and risky conditions because of wars, poverty, and persecution, religion, and ideological persecution. So this is a very important theme for me, as I am a Swiss person, and as I am myself, a person who had migrated in some ways. But recently, living so many years in Brazil, I observed how deep and the effects of climate changes over life, and how frequent are becoming the environment tragedies with the death of biodiversity and human beings. So this is also a very important theme for me. I mean, observing our contemporaneity and our climate changes. In Brazil, this is very, how can I say, this is very evident.
I get that. I mean, yeah, I think that finds a lot of overlap in India also. So I don't know, would you talk a little bit about your work and the kind of, in fact, something that I've always wanted to ask you also, how do you choose what to translate? How do you figure out what format speaking to you, what literature is speaking to you? Because you're doing so much of, like it said in your bio also, from Bengali to English, and then other languages, to English, and other literatures to. How do you pick your work, and what has changed over time in what has driven those decisions?
Thank you, Swati, and lovely to meet you, Prisca. Yes, so I've been translating for about 15 years now. And I think I started out with pretty much the well-established works in Bangla. And the canon is quite well known and quite wide. So it was easy enough initially to pick off the books one after the other, books that I'd read earlier and come to like very much. And there were publishers willing to publish them in translation. But I think the last 5 years or so, the past 5 years have been more interesting in that I found myself moving away from the canon, which is also in Bengali, like perhaps in many other languages, the equivalent of, it's dominated by the privileged, those who have access to publishing channels, and of course, those who have access to writing and time and a little bit of leisure. So I've been looking increasingly for literature from the margins, from people who are not writers by profession, but who have chosen to pick up the pen almost to write about things because they find that that is how they can talk about their lives and their realities to others. And unlike in the past, when these lives and realities used to be represented by or presented by other writers, now the marginalized are writing for themselves. So I thought that it might be a good idea to try and pick books from these segments and bring them to readers in other languages, notably English, because in India, as you know, readers all over the country read English, and it is a world language going out to people all over the world as well. And it's also interesting that all the themes that I'm recently interested in are all embodied in what Prisca talked about, which is climate change and migration and displacement. And I think no book probably represents this better than a book I just finished translating a couple of months ago, Amitav Ghosh's The Gun Island from English into Bangla, which places migration from the delta of the Ganges in India and Bangladesh, the Sundarbans, migration into, as it happens, Europe and Italy in particular, and juxtaposes it with climate change, both as a reason and as an outcome, and also looks at what role stories and old legends have to play in bringing the truth when rational forms of discourse cannot always capture all the material that we have. So yes, I would say that working with books and working with translation is a huge benefit because you can be a different book and a different writer every 2 months or so.
So you talked about bringing the truth to people and talking about how you transport stories of migration and about climate change across. Just the act of translation does that. So in fact, before we get into the smaller details of what goes behind translating a work, which is something I find fascinating, I do want to ask you to talk about just what translating means to you and what the idea of the act of translation means to you, because for a lot of people, maybe a lot of people in the audience too, sometimes us ourselves, we just look at translation as something which is basically shifting words from one language to another, but it's so much more than that, and it's not that mechanical. It comes with nuances. It comes with what to inhabit and what to inhibit. So all of those things are part of translation. So if Prisca and Arunava, both of you could talk a little bit about what the act of translation means to you and what has made you take it on, what has pushed you towards a journey into translating and into taking up something like this as your life's work.
Well,
Prisca, would you like to start?
Yeah. Yes. Well, I think that the act of translating is well, I see the translator as a little bit as a ferryman or a ferrywoman, taking people from one to the other edge. So, but midway, many things almost imperceptible can happen. The rule I think that involves flexibility, mental strength, and passion. I mean, I think it's a question of passion as well. The fact that we listen to, as Arunava was telling us, the fact that we listen to voices that maybe will never reach other people if we don't take them like with a ferry boat to the other side. So it's a question of passion toward life and toward people. Um, I I'm particularly aware of language and specific oral language. I come from a reality, a small country, but where we speak a lot of dialects, and the the most of them we can't read. I mean, my grandparents spoke dialect with us. I speak dialect with my family, but I can't read what I speak.
Right.
And so we feel that there is a great richness in that, but sometimes we lose. Here in Brazil, we have a lot of indigenous communities, and every day we lose those languages, those oral languages, and vision of world. So I think the translation is quite um, a way of keeping those realities in mind and alive.
Hmm.
I think that it's something like that. I don't know what Aruana think, but I think it's something like that for me.
I don't know. I mean, isn't that a lot of overlap with India, and just the fact that so much dialect, so much cultural, differences within the country. So, what would you say that is a big part of translation for you also?
Well, yes, it's an inevitable outcome, and you can't take your eyes off that.
Mhm.
Otherwise, India is what we are home to about 2 dozen official languages,
Mhm.
hundreds of versions of those languages, and then thousands of
Yeah.
dialects.
Yeah.
So each of these would remain an island had there not been the ability to take words and literatures across from one language to another. But the other interesting thing in India, of course, is that we are all natural born translators in the sense that
Mhm.
we inhabit more than one language
Yeah.
because we are thinking in one language. We are often being made to speak in another, write in a third sometimes. And
Mhm.
while there may be overlaps, we are all translating all the time. We're
That,
translating life itself. So
yeah.
in a sense, formal translation is just a matter of codifying an everyday process.
Mhm.
And I have to say that it's also a very selfish act because you get to write a
Mhm.
great book without having to think of what's in it in
Yeah.
some ways. So, but no, there is that great joy. I mean, it's very much like singing a song that you love on listening and you want to sing it for yourself. And you keep trying to do better and better at it, right? To give it your kind of perfection.
Mhm.
So
Right.
I find translation very similar to that as an activity. But also, I think it is a way to show what a language is capable of in its literature. Because let's say, take the fact that I translate from Bangla into English. Now, English has its own vast and diverse literature, but none of it was written in Bangla. It was all written in English. But now, because translations from Bangla and indeed from French and Italian and
Mhm.
Portuguese and hundreds of other languages are going into English, I think readers in English are beginning to see what their own words are capable of doing for them, which is much more than perhaps the writers who wrote in English to begin with could do, because these
Hmm.
books originate in different cultures, different spaces, different times. So that is a very it's almost like a drug, because you see that this is what is happening, and you're in some small way adding to the literature of another language, but in a very weird new way. So
Yeah.
it's very exciting and very addictive.
I mean, that answers one of the questions I want to ask you, which is, just we know what translating a piece of literature from one language to another does for the target language that you're translating it into, but also it does so much for the source language, and it like kind of it changes the source language also every time it's translated, every time. So in that brings me to the idea of language itself, and because as a translator your relationship with the language is I would say that's involved in a way that a lot of times I'm not constantly thinking of a word and figuring out if this word fits another a meaning or another nuance
Mhm.
is there. So that kind of deeper understanding and deeper involvement with the language itself, I feel like, I mean, is that something that you deliberate on a lot? I mean, Prisca, is your relationship with the language changing, especially because you translate your own work also? So you're writing in one language and then you're also translating it yourself, and then you're translating other authors and other works. So
Mhm.
how has your own relationship with the language evolved in during that process?
Well, when I translate an author, which is not my work, of course, when you read a novel or a book just as a lecture, you don't go so deeper. I mean, I think that you don't go so deeper into the complexity, the syntax complexity, the semantical complexity, the structure, the mental structure that builds the book. When you do it as a translator, you really have another kind of lecture. I mean, it's like a, how can I say, the one who goes deep and deep in the ocean. I don't know how to say it in English, but it's like when you go very deep, very deep, very deep, each time more. I see my work as a translator a little bit like that when I work with another text. I mean, you don't find a final point. I mean, it's always it's like a traveling. I mean, you start the travel, but you can't say, once you start traveling, you can't say that you are finished. I mean, we're always mentally ready to travel again. I mean, it's like a starting point, but you don't find a final point. But when I work with my own work, it's different because I start from the total freedom, and I prepare myself in a mental condition that I expect from myself that I interfere freer in the translation. I mean, I expect it from myself that I will interfere in the source text and the target text. So it's different because it's not something that I will find, by the way. I will start knowing that I will interfere. So I think that the starting point is different when I work with my own work. It's another process. Okay, I am mentally ready for that. When I work with another author, it's like I keep the work a little bit under control. I mean, I don't allow me to be so free, of course, because I respect. I have to not only respect but also listen carefully of what the book tells me. I mean, when I work with my own work, I listen to myself and I can say to myself, no, Prisca, now I want to change. Let's do something different. Let's do something really new. Let's see what goes on. So it's quite different process.
So Arunava, in terms of this like the process of interference and of how to navigate another person's voice, another person's story that they're telling, how has your work evolved in terms of how you did it before to how you did it now? Has there been a lot of change in how you've started viewing language and how you've started how the process of how you translate has changed? Is it something vastly different? Are there overlaps, similarities?
Well, I wouldn't say it's vastly different in the sense that when I started out, it was with the idea of, as Prisca said, add nothing and subtract nothing.
Right.
And I still stick to that, add nothing and subtract nothing. It's somebody else's work. The question, of course, is what I'm hearing and what I'm reading. And therefore, what I consider is the basic material to which I must add or subtract nothing. So I think that reading improves as you go along translating. It improves because, like anything, presumably you become better at what you do as you go along, or else you're very bad to begin with and you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. But you're very right in saying that the relationship is with the language. Translation is an act of managing language and working with language. I do not consider it so much a literary activity as I consider it a linguistic activity. In fact, when you're translating a text, you're so close to the text in every sense of the word that you forget its literary qualities or antecedents or traditions or who this writer is in the canon or so on, or where they stand in the grand scheme of things. No, you are only concerned with the text, and you are only concerned with the author to the extent that the author is visible and audible and talking to you through all your sense organs. Through that text alone, nothing else matters.
Right.
So you start appreciating, I think, the way language is used. The more you start working on it, you start seeing I think the precision you always see. What you learn to see is the ambiguity. You learn to see the gray areas. You learn to see how this actually points in three different directions and not just one. As most readers, we like to come to sharp, definitive conclusions. We say, this is what this text, where it's taking us. This is what it means. As a translator, you can't afford to be reductive in that sense. If you see a richness in possible interpretations, you have to keep that richness in your translated version as well, so that the reader can then decide on the basis of your text. You cannot decide on behalf of the reader. So all of this leads to a very different kind of reading, because you're always reading to see, am I missing something? Is there more to it than meets the eye? Am I a suitably, am I trained as a reader, or have I trained myself as a reader, but not so trained as to miss the freshness altogether? Because the other worry is that if you come to a text as a very jaded reader, almost a cynical reader, then you very often are going to miss its joy. And if you don't catch the joy, your translation will miss the joy as well. And I believe that most writers write because they love what they're writing, and there is certainly joy in their writing. The subject matter may be very grim, but there is joy in the writing. So these are the elements of the writer, I think, that you try to identify. But to be honest, these are not things you break down. It's not like you make a list of 10 things and you say, yeah, I have to capture these 10 things. They come together as a whole. And somewhere you create your translated version, and then maybe you validate it to see if all the things that you read in the first version, you're still reading in the second version as well.
So, I think I get what you mean, in the sense of there's no one process, and there's also no hard and fast. Like, so I did think of asking you about the routine that you have of translating your work. Is there a specific mechanism that you follow? Is there some specific process that you follow? But it sounds like, from what you said and what Prisca has also been talking about, that it seems like there's a lot of it is intuitive, a lot of it is coming as you read the work, what you're taking from the work. So is that something that you would agree with, that there's no one set routine that you follow when you're translating?
Prisca?
Well, I won't say that I have a routine. In my own life, I'm not just a translator. So I work as a teacher, I'm a writer, I have children. So what I try to do is prepare myself when I have to translate a novel, specifically a novel, because I've already seen that I can't translate a novel by interrupting the work. I feel like I have to go ahead a period of time just working on it. It's very difficult for me to translate a novel and by interrupting it. So my only routine is that when I have a novel or a proposal, I read the book and I say, okay, if I see that I have, I don't know, 2 months or time enough for working slowly on it. So because I can't count the time. I can't see how much time this translation will ask me. I mean, I have an idea, but you find so many ambiguities and things that you have to go back and research. So for me, it's still very difficult to know exactly the time I have to put in a translation when it is specific of a prose. So I try to respect this in my own life, and I try to keep a work when I know that I can work on it without pressure.
Got it. So, Arunava, would you say is similar to you, like in the sense that no set, I'm thinking also about things like deadlines, and I'm thinking about how that would convert when it comes to translating, right? Because I mean, there's a difference, I guess, in terms of how. If you go from a project, I mean, you start a project to when it's supposed to get published, so those kind of deadlines, those kind of things, how does that play into in when it comes to translations?
No, it does, in the sense that I do set myself a daily target of how many words I will have in translation in whichever draft I'm on. So when I'm on the first draft, I usually set myself a daily target of 3,000 words in English, translated into English, or 2,500 words translated into Bangla, because it's a more compact language. But how I will get there is you can never predict. on a day-to-day basis. I can't tell you which part of the day it will be, because like Prisca, I teach. Luckily, my son is now in college, so at least I don't have to worry about spend too much on him. But I have another son who has 4 legs and demands a lot of time, and your household chores, and so you have all of those. And in a way, this pandemic has spoiled us, I think, because it has confined us indoors, that miraculously we've found a little more time than we would have had we been commuting and going to work and so on. So that's helped to some extent, but it's also messed with our mind. So I don't know, maybe net is the same thing. But yeah, I try to keep the 3,000 words target at least, and I get and see if I can't make it. But I'm not so hung up that I will not sleep at night because I couldn't meet the target today, because it's also a sort of 7-day average. I mean, if I do 21,000 words over 7 days, I'm happy. So, I can catch up.
So it seems like, I mean, both of you have a similar sort of idea when it comes to translation. But I feel like what I'd like to know from you is the challenges that you face in terms of different, because you are translating across formats. So, I was thinking about poetry translations. And would you say that when translating poetry, there's a larger sort of responsibility on the translator to get a certain amount of nuance that the author... So basically what I'm thinking about is, poetry has so many layers that sometimes it'll come with a single word, and just finding the right word in translation for that, or trying to figure out if the flow or the verse or the the scansion, the rhythm, all of that, to maintain all of that in the work and still translate in truthfully and honestly. How much challenge does poetry translation pose? And from there, I'd like to go into certain other aspects of translation that at least I'm curious about, in terms of how that would translate and how it's difficult. So let's start with poetry. Both of you talk about a little bit about translating poetry. Prisca?
Well, I think that there are two different approaches, but I don't think that translating poetry is more difficult or easier. I mean, I think a very good translation demands the same skills from the translator. I mean, of course, there are people. For example, me, I'm a poet, so I'm more. I work naturally better with poetry because I work with this gender, so with this literary gender. So it's easier maybe for me because I am I experienced reader of poetry, but I don't think that translating poetry is easier or more difficult. I think that a very good translation depends on the same skills from the translator. And for example, there are specific things when you translate prose, like dialogues.
Yes, I was thinking
which I find it very difficult. I'm talking about myself, because it obliges you to know very, very well the colloquial language and slangs on both languages. So sometimes I find it more difficult than poetry, because depending on the poem, you stay in a certain level of language that it's not deeply involved to oral language. So I think that it's more technical. It's what Arunava was telling us. It's more linguistic than literature, a literary problem. I mean, knowing very well a language is not. It depends not on the gender of what you are translating. Sometimes it depends more about on the knowledge you have of the different levels of the language. I mean, the slang or things like that. So for me, translating poetry is quite. It poses the same problem of translating prose. I have just a difference is that me, I can translate poetry interrupting it. The rhythm is different. I mean, when I translate a novel, as I was saying before, I have to look to have a very a long time for me. When I translate poetry, it's easier for me to manage it with other things at the same time. It's a question of organization. I mean, I think I am more prepared to translate poetry, doing other things at the same time, teaching, or it's like I mean, a window I have during my day. I can translate 2, 3, 4 poems, and it's okay. But poem and prose, sometimes you have to really work as a marathonist, the one who runs. I mean, you have to do something like 10 kilometers per day, otherwise the book doesn't go ahead. So the only difference for me is that the way we approach translation.
And Arunava, what about you? Because you're also doing poetry, prose, non-fiction, fiction. Is poetry difficult, or is there another thing that poses more challenge to you? Dialogue, especially. I mean, Prisca said it. When you're translating Bengali to English, I mean, there are these colloquialisms, there are these phrases that if you try to kind of convert into English in the way that they're written, all the meaning, all the flavor would go. So, how does it work for you? Dialogues, poetry. What is the challenge that you face when you're looking at
Yeah,
translation?
no, so the challenge, yeah, I agree totally with Prisca that it's not that poetry is necessarily more difficult than prose. Both good prose and, I mean, good prose is also poetry in the sense that both have their hidden dimensions. You have the words in front of you, but there are many dimensions folded into them. And really, whether you'll translate them well depends on how well you read in the first place. If you're a good, sensitive reader, then you'll know what it is you need to take into the new language. And then if you can write well enough, you will succeed. If you don't write well enough, you could also be, like me, my singing. I'm a frustrated musician because I know that I sing off key. I really envy people who sing off key and don't know it. But because I know I sing off key, I don't dare sing at all. So you must know what, when you're in tune and when you're not. And of course, you must be able to be in tune, or else it's not going to work. But in some senses, poetry is easier because some of these dimensions are more obvious, such as rhyme and rhythm, and these things you can almost mechanically figure out. So it's less difficult. But I find one methodological difference in the way I translate poetry is that sometimes in poetry, entire lines appear to come to me. I know I play with the words in my head and I don't write them down till a fully formed line appears. And of course, that doesn't mean that's going to be the final version, but you get somewhere close to it. And I think that poetry is not just individual words threaded together. It is entire units, and those who write poetry, Prisca, you write poetry as well. Entire lines come to you, don't they? Sometimes it's not that you're thinking of individual words or phrases. So that is useful. You can't count on it happening, but sometimes it can. And I think it does when the original is so good that it automatically shapes itself in another language.
Yeah.
In fact, I find that the best prose is easier to translate. Badly written literature is much tougher to translate.
Yeah.
Contrary to
appeal that it has across, I mean, a good story well told, I can imagine it just working in different languages as opposed to,
and the thing is that languages have something in common, right? They have in common that they're a feature of taking what's in your head and putting them into sounds that are intelligible to others. And those basic rules are not different for the human species. It's just that the specific sound and their configurations are different. So if the text itself is words for a kind of thought or idea which is very excellent, then it will be possible to render it in different languages in an easier way than a very lousy idea, which you will always struggle to find words for no matter which language you're putting it, because it doesn't lend itself well to expression. It's resisting expression because it's so bad.
Yeah, no, so okay, so you talked about the similarities in language, right? The similarity of languages and why they exist in the first place. But I'm also interested in the differences in language and the fact that a lot of languages have history, cultural experiences. I was thinking about gendered languages which are written in a way that it's lending itself to a certain kind of experience that it's come from. So there are words that are not even present in certain languages, like because that experience is absent from that the shaping of that language. So what happens then when you're taking, I mean, both Prisca and Arunava, we are from countries where there's so much diversity, cultural diversity, but there's also a lot of interaction between cultures in a way that one has shaped the other in terms of what languages have emerged. So when you are translating from a certain experience, when you're translating from a certain language and to a language that doesn't have that experience in it, what happens then when, from Bengali to English, from French to English, what happens then? Prisca, would you want to talk about that first?
Yes, I'm thinking, but I don't know if I really have an experience to share with you, because I
Okay.
translate between languages like Portuguese, Italian. Of
Hmm.
course, there are differences in them, but I don't know if there are so differences in terms of what you ask.
Right.
Well, I've just translated a novel by a Brazilian author, which is Beatriz Brascher, to in Italy. And there, what I experience is that, for example, a Portuguese language, spoken Portuguese language in Brazil, is much more flexible in terms of pronouns and referring to the subject or the person, or it is very ambiguous. The context takes a very important place in Brazilian speech, which is not the case. I mean, I couldn't translate it into Italian, maintaining the same fluency, because Italian language is much more, how can I say, strict. Even when we speak, we use we have to say to use a pronoun. We have to say who is the subject, or I mean, we can't simply cut it from the language. It sounds false. So those kind of things, yes, I experience when I translate between the two languages, but I don't know if it is as deep as your question
No, I get.
asked me. You know, because
Aruna, would you have an experience like that of not being able to kind of completely translate that experience of that language to say English when you're translating?
Yes, all the time. But
mm,
my whole point is that I am not unhappy at the fact that the English language cannot provide for that experience, because it
mm,
originates in a different space, a different culture, a different time amongst different people. So if I were to then reduce it to something that my readers in English are already aware of, I would be doing great disservice to the
mhm,
original. So then you try to construct that experience,
mhm.
and it may seem foreign, it may seem alien to the reader in a different language compared to the way it seems to the reader in the original language. But that is the whole idea. I mean, if I visit Brazil today, it's not going to look to me like my backyard.
Yeah.
Rio de Janeiro is not going to look like Calcutta or Delhi to me, and it should not, right? It would be very sad if it did.
Yeah.
So I must view it with the same wonder and curiosity as I would a new place. So I want my translation of new experiences and new ideas to evoke the same wonder and curiosity, even puzzlement,
Yeah.
even a requirement to say, I don't understand this, which is
Yeah.
fine. That's
That's
exactly the point.
a great perspective. Actually, I hadn't
And
thought of that as looking at it from that lens.
Yeah, but sometimes there are very interesting situations as well. For example, this is not about Bengali and English, but I believe this may be apocryphal, but it's still a very good story. That in Russian you don't have a word for blue; you have either light blue or dark
mm,
blue. So, which means that when you're translating from, say, English or French or Spanish, and you're talking about something blue, you have to make a choice. Do I make it
yes,
light blue or dark blue? Because Russian will not accommodate anything unless you now say, I will invent blue for Russians.
For
And I
Russian.
will say it is something that is neither light blue nor dark blue, but imagine something that is both or neither, something like that. So
Right.
I think these are great. Actually, these are great puzzles. And
Yeah.
I read somewhere that translation is half poetry, half crossword puzzle, and that is so true.
That is very true, actually. Yeah, I get. I mean, okay. So I think I've been told we can go for the readings, but before we go for the reading, I have one more question for you, and we'll take the rest on the other side of the reading, which is, I've always thought when I'm reading translations, also I'm thinking of what might be more important to the translator. I'm not sure if there's an answer to this that's right or wrong, but just when you're translating, what kind of takes precedence for you? Is it the accuracy that you want to stay, accurate to the truth to the text, or is it compromising a little bit of the accuracy in favor of the flow of the text, or do those two come together always naturally? Because sometimes I feel like the accuracy might fight a little bit with the flow. You might need to remove a little bit here or there, is what it seems like to me. But not being a translator myself, I don't know if that's true. So what would you say? Is there a balance, or is there something that you prefer? Or yeah, Arunava, do you want to go first?
Okay. I start with the assumption that I'll be able to protect all of it. So I don't start with the assumption that I'm free to play around with these things.
Right.
And then I will be flexible only if I absolutely am unable to do both. But I'm not close to the idea. Sometimes, for example, in Bangla, it's a very florid, effervescent language, and some practitioners tend to go overboard. Now, if you maintain the accuracy, you'll end up with 4 adjectives in English, which will completely ruin the effect, because in Bangla, it is not meant to be over the top. When you're reading it in Bangla, it seems quite okay. So you don't want an over the top experience in English. So then you pare it down a little bit and so on. But I would not call that inaccurate, because I am also aiming for accuracy in effect.
Okay.
That is very important for me. A text that is accurate in every word but leaves me angry in the translated version when I'm all mellow in the original version is a complete failure. So, and that's what machine translation often does. So,
yeah.
So that's perhaps for me the single biggest priority, the effect.
And Prisca?
Yes, I agree. It depends on the language. I mean, there are languages which, as I was telling before, which are much more flexible when you talk about oral conditions. And if you try to keep, you have to choose between keeping the same ambience, but there you have to choose how to translate not the word by word, but the ambience of a certain fluency, a certain colloquial context. Sometimes you have to change each word in the sentence just in order to keep the ambience, So there, the accuracy, it's much more related to flexibility, of the skill of changing words, respecting which you decide together with the editor sometimes, which is the most important for the one who receives the text. So it's not something you can say now. I mean, it's always a negotiation between the first text and the text you are translating. I mean, it depends on the language the author uses, if it is a colloquial, a very intellectual, or on the effect he wants to reach. And you have to understand the effect he wants to reach in his own language to translate it. Sometimes the language you use, I mean, Italian has other or French, or I mean, I don't know, dialects, or have other specific ways to reach some effects. And you don't have the instruments, but you have to create them. So it's always a negotiation between accuracy and the effect you reach.
I think what's becoming clear is, it's much more complex than an either or. It's much more than asking a question, which is, oh, do you do this or do you do that? There's no either translation. It's just sort of like but okay. So before we go to the last few questions, I'd like to invite both of you to read from your work. Prisca, can I invite you on first to read something?
I'll read some poems, but I didn't translate them myself because I don't translate into English. So I'll read 3 poems. They have been I have written them in Portuguese, and they have been translated by Johnny Lawrence, which is a Brazilian American translator who lives in the United States. And they have been published in a Canadian review these days. Okay, yeah, I talk a little bit about migration. They come from my recent book, The Mutilated Word. They don't know they are angels, those angels living with us in the camp, used to digging through garbage. In their stomach, they know hunger. In their muscles, a cramping pain. They scan tongues like fallen fruit rotting on the ground in a tower of Babel made horizontal. Here, where Slavic Latin snaps open its seeds slow to flower, in the day's liver we distilled our alcohol. The angels, elusive, wander out on the outskirts of Indomene. They carry with them other spectres, faces of fallen ones lying in their memory. Together they go round and round in limbo in the camps, where perpetual fugitives occupy the land of pendulum, while they wait in single file for the return of the human age. The tongue has no barbed wire, no denial of entry. Our refuge is nothing but ourselves, and the enduring borders between words, doors on which we knock, waiting for the living, barges taking us from one shore to the next.
Thank you. That was lovely. Do you have more
Thank
for us?
you. Yes, do you have some more time?
Yeah, let's hear
Okay.
one more and then we'll go to Arunava.
Okay, okay. Um, but this poem has been translated from Seamus Negus, which is a Californian translator. Okay. The pain is in the shoe, twisted, waiting for the foot. Do not leave your shoes untidy. You should not do this, not even upside down, like buried things, seedling roots to the ground flower in full abandonment. Where the fruit scattered, where the table ready, the smile from yesterday that shakes in the dark of today and coagulates the milk in the morning. Where, where, the red scarf suspended on the white wall that cuts the way into the before, the emptiness, the after, the day after. Where, the unspeakable abandoned feet paths in the shoe waiting.
Thank you so much, Prisca. That
Very
was
nice.
wonderful.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Arunava,
All right,
what do
thanks. I'll just read the opening passage from a new translated book that's come out. It's called Khwab Nama, the Book of Dreams. It was written by a writer from Bangladesh. It's set in completely in a rural part of what was undivided India before the 1947 partition, and then soon afterwards. So as you can imagine, the language is very earthy and lacks the finesse of the urban version of Bengali. The spot where Tamiz's father stood with his feet planted in the mud, craning his neck as high as possible, stretching his nerves taut, and waving his jet black arms to dispel the grey clouds, needs to be noted carefully. A long time ago, when leave alone Tamiz's father, even his father had not been born, when his grandfather Bhagar Maji's birth was still a long way in the future, when Bhagar Maji's grandfather's father, or was it his grandfather, had barely been born or not, and even if he had, was only crawling about on the newly laid earth in the home built by clearing a part of the forest. On one afternoon during those days, while he was speeding towards the Kartoa River to visit the Mahasthan Killa with several of Majnu Shah's fakirs, Munshi Barkatullah Shah was flung from his horse after being shot dead by Taylor, the commander of British troops. The hole left in his neck by the bullet was never filled. After his death, with a chain around his neck and his body smeared with ash, and holding an iron pan with fish motifs carved on it, he perched on the fig tree on the northern side of the Katahar lake. Ever since then, he became the sunlight during the day and spread himself all over the lake and reigned over the lake all night from the fig tree. Tamiz's father waved his arms to get rid of the clouds in the sky in the hope of catching a glimpse of Munshi, which was all very well. But 2 or 2.25 years from now, or maybe 2.5, or even 3, after drowning to death in the quicksand In one corner of the bank recently sprung from the receding waters of the lake, where would Tamiz's father surface? Who was going to make room for him? The large jackfruit trees had long been cleared out by the fangs of the big flood, and once Sharafat Mondol's son had set up his brick kiln, the remaining trees would also be swallowed by the kiln. What would happen then? Where would Tamiz's father float up? The lake dried up rapidly, the dry land was cultivated, and people built their homes along the perimeter of the land. Would there be room for a large tree anymore? By daylight, it was clear to the eye. To the west, the land between the western bank of the lake and the edge of the creek here was still empty. Majipara, where the fishermen lived, began at this point. Not that the people of Majipara referred to their enclave as a neighborhood, for they used to occupy the entire village once. Now, though, 60 or 70% of them were peasants. Several families of Kolus had lived here, extracting oil for a living. But within 3 years of Tabibur Mukhtar's Rahman oil mill being set up in the town, 8 miles to the west, more than half of them had left for the bank of the Jamuna to the east. The few who had remained were more inclined toward farming, and so on.
I must say, I've been wanting to read this forever, so I'm very excited to hear the first few paras in your words. But thank you so much, Arunava. I think that's for the readings. Now, just a few last questions and before we close. I think we've covered a lot about, translating and about what goes behind, the process of translating. But I feel like one of the things that remains is looking at the implications of translations and what it can do in a world that's constantly becoming smaller. It's almost a cliche now, we say it's a small world, but it's also a very fractured world, and it's a divided world, and all the differences between us seem to just be growing with social media and with a lot of other. I think as we grow closer, we also kind of grow further apart, because it's easier to dehumanize, it's easier to kind of look at the other as the other. In that kind of climate, in a climate that is fractured, what do you think, has the role of the translator evolved? Has it become more important? Because like you said right in the beginning, Prisca, the idea of ferrying stories from one place to another, the idea of acting like a sort of channel or a mediator between two cultures or languages, would you say that that's become more important than ever now, especially in the view of both countries that you're talking about, the idea of minorities, the idea of different diversity, and then finding a sort of bridge between them, bridge between the two. So would you say the role has sort of evolved and grown?
It's a very important and difficult question, because there are many things involved. Well, it exists today. I mean, I'm talking about Brazil, specifically Brazil is the context I know better, because here the claims of minorities are very, very high and very strong, and they have a reason to exist, historical reason to exist. So I think that we should always be careful looking at, listening to those claims. I mean, society changes because we have claims that we have to take care of them. I mean, sometimes society changes slowly, sometimes quickly by shocks, no? So I think we have to be careful and understand certain claims. But on the other hand, I think that that was specifically talking about pressure. I feel they are very strong over book markets. For example, here it's very important to respect the fact that if you translate an Afro-Brazilian author, you should first try to find an Afro-Brazilian translator. I mean, it is very strong nowadays. And I think that there is a reason for that. I mean, we don't have simply to say no. But at the same time, I think that we should be careful, because the act of translating, for me, I think it's always an intermediary between cultures and its conflicts. So try to be careful, because not to promote walls, but to try to promote empathy, dialogue and negotiations. So it's not, I don't have an answer, a unique answer. I mean, I think that we have to listen to that, to understand, to learn to listen the others. I mean, the first point. um, the rule of translating, the rule of being a diplomatic intermediary starts from the skill to listen to the others. I mean, so I think that's very important. But on the other hand, I think that we have to keep in mind, for me, it's very important that translating and translating is an act in a human work. So we have to stay human. I mean, try to build together a more dialogical society and not walls. So I stay there between, you know.
Arnav, what would you say? I think you answered a part of this right in the beginning when you talked about, finding
Mhm.
more
Yeah.
obscure work, more work from not the privileged, not the Savarna. So if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yes. So, the act of translation may not have changed much, but everything around it has changed greatly. And
Yeah.
it starts, as Prisca was saying, with whom you translate, who you choose to
Mhm.
translate. For every book you translate, there's another book you will not. And now, if you start taking on yourself this decision, then you are also becoming a repository of power. So that's not the
Mhm.
idea either. The idea is actually to completely decentralize, to take away the locus, as it were, and to let all these activities and decisions come from the ground up. So yes, I think it is very important for early movers in translation like ourselves to actually find translators from within the communities whose works will be translated. So I, for example, am very keen that I find Bengali Dalit translators to translate the vast literatures that's being produced over there. And so in that sense, that paving the way for such things without being um, without acting like a lord and master who dispenses alms
Mhm.
is crucially important. Also, I was very struck by what Priska said about the fact that you are translating between cultures, and it is important not to create an adversarial situation. And that is
Mhm.
very easy to do because both Brazil and India, for example, are, are post-colonial cultures today. We've both been colonized for long
Of
periods of
course.
time, and we both tend to either write or translate into the language of our colonizers. And it's very easy to make that a weapon, to weaponize it, and to say that I will give you as good as I got, but now using your language and so on.
That's true.
But that is not the reality of the 21st century. The reality of the
Mhm.
21st century is not about putting up walls, as Prisca said, but about
Yes.
creating bridges between islands, and to indeed realize that we are a world where the more diversity there is, the better it is for everybody, and
Mhm.
therefore things need to be recognized for what they are and not what you want to make them into.
Yes.
So let translation bring literatures the way they are into
Yeah.
other, for other people to interact with them, to appreciate them, and to give back some of their own, and let there not be a relationship of power between either of the two languages. Now,
Right.
I'm not saying that these are things that a translator can consciously do while translating a book, but the larger ecosystem of translation can go a long way towards
Mhm.
determining these things, and translators play a very big role there,
Right.
especially when you consider English literature, which is very much centered in the West. You have to start thinking in terms of how to slowly dismantle the gatekeeping and how to create a more um, democratic flow of literature across from different place spaces. For example, so much of English writing originates in Africa. How much of it do we actually get to read? We don't, because some people in the West are controlling what will be published. So in today's age, given new technologies, new digitization, and indeed the fact that we can now talk to one another anywhere in the world, how can we use these technologies to make the flow smoother and two ways, and in fact, not just two ways, in multiple ways. I think so. Translators have, as ambassadors, very key roles to play here in the future. And I think translators have to take the initiative here. No one's going to wait to, you can't wait for somebody to come to say, here, you guys do it.
Yeah. So
Can I add
that's, yeah.
something? Can I add
Yes, yes.
something of what Rava said? I think that the fact that there are many authors that write in both languages, I mean, they ought to translate themselves a little bit what I do, but specifically when people come from these realities, post-colonial realities, I think it's a way of promoting not depending on what others decide you to be translated. I mean, I have many friends from East region of Europe that women specifically, that they translate themselves and they reach by internet, by reviews. They are published in Argentina, in United States, not passing by a choice that others do, or whether I would or not translate her. You know, it's a way of how can I say? It's a way of reaching new lectures without passing by those. I mean, those decisions that sometimes depend on political reasons. You know. So I think that the fact that there are people writing and auto-translating themselves, it's also a political act in that way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think this gives a very good overview of what this I was looking for, just the idea of what a translation can do. So okay, so I just have a couple of last questions for you before I know we have to close at 8. So one is something that I've always thought about, when I read reviews of translations. What do you think about, what do you think when a review of a translation comes out where the reviewer might not have read the source book? So what do you think that's something that takes away from the review? I'm just thinking of in terms of critiques of translations and reviews of translations. If, say, the critique comes without the understanding of the book that it was originally written in, do you think there's something there that's lacking, that's absent, that should be there? Or do you think that's a review entirely on itself, that's of the work, and not reading the source language would have nothing to do with it? Arunava, do you want to take that? Because I know you,
Okay.
I know you also, you're also the book's editor, so which means that reviews is also something that's your. So it'll be great to hear from you about that.
Sure. So I think it cuts both ways, in the sense that it's useful if a reviewer has read the first version of the text, because then they can at least do justice to the question of how well the translation lives up to the first version, which is always good to know for a reader, certainly, because they are, after all, reading, as far as they're concerned, in their head, they're reading the original text. It's just that they happen to be reading in a different language. So perhaps if I'm reading Prisca, I would like to be assured that I am indeed reading Prisca and not what a translator has made of Prisca's work. So that's good. On the other hand, when the reviewer knows of the original text, they also sometimes become someone correcting papers in an exam, because then they are judging the translation against their own knowledge. And that can become a bit tiresome and unfair to the translation, which also at the end of the day is a new work of art, a new work of literature. So also needs to be read and appreciated or dissed, as the case might be, on its own terms. So it's a fine balance. But I think if you told me, you choose one or the other, I would choose the second option, not reading the original, because I would like to know at the end of the day whether the reviewer feels this is a good book or not.
Stands on its own or not. Yeah.
And then, if it turns out that the translator has, so what are the possibilities? If the translation is a good book, then either they've done a good job, the original is a good book, the translation is a good book, or they have done a miracle by taking a bad book and turning it into a good book. which in the large scheme of things may not be a bad idea, because we're recycling garbage anyway. So if you're upcycling a mediocre work into a better work, I'm saying, why not? There must have been something in there for it to realize the possibility of being better. Maybe it just needed a different craftsman. You can have a great tune very badly rendered, and it sounds like a bad song, till a good singer comes along and makes something beautiful out of it. So I'm not objecting to that. And if the writer, if the reviewer says this is a bad book, then there are two possibilities: that the original was bad and that it is a bad translation of a good book. But either way, you're basically saying don't read it. And you're not serving any purpose by saying, I have read the original, it is excellent, the translation is very bad. What difference does it make? You're still telling the reader don't read it. So it doesn't matter eventually. So I would much rather they brought the freshness of perspective into reading a new work and not read it very differently.
Prisca, would you agree? I think this is I think I see what you mean, Arunava. It might be better the second way around. Yeah.
Unfortunately, books editors tend inevitably to hand over translations to those who know the original language,
Yeah.
on the assumption that they'll do a better job.
Prisca, what do you
Yes,
think?
I agree with him. I've never thought about it, but what I see, for example, in Italy or here in Brazil, is that normally the reviews, they trust well-known translators. So there is quite a pact. I mean, if it's a very known translator, normally they trust. I mean, but when you start, once you're starting as a translator, it is rare where you find criticism against or pro translate. Sometimes normally you normally don't talk about translation. It's what I see. So once you have a name, you have your own work which is respected, and so I see that people trust and the establishment trust on you. And but I've never seen a criticism against translation. Maybe more in poetry, because sometimes you have both versions, in the book. So it's easier for you to compare. But in a novel, I think it's rare. I have never seen. Normally, when I see something about the translation, it's to say that it's a very good translation because the translator is very known and so on. But it's my own experience. I mean, I don't have many experience like Arunava, so.
No, but typically there will be one adjective thrown in. Where the book is mentioned, it will be said translated, fill in the blanks by so and so, and that fill in the blank could be smoothly, luminously, flexibly, seamlessly,
Like
some
all
generic.
Something I'd like to add, which is I think is very important to say. It's very I'm worried about. Normally in Brazil, they don't tell the name of the translator. It's very often, it happens very often. They don't even mention who translated the book. Just when it is a very known translator. So I think that is a point. We are part of a mechanical system. It is thought as a mechanical work, technical work, to put a book in from a language to another. They don't even mention. So I always write in internet, when they don't mention, I ask, please mention the work of the translator. I mean, without us, we wouldn't have the book. So it's a very important big problem here in Brazil nowadays.
Yeah, in fact, sometimes I think of when the nights when I can't sleep too well, I do this thought experiment. It's the same thought experiment every day. Imagine a world with no translators. And now just examine your life. And maybe it's a book, because the way the world would be different, we can't even imagine.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, most of the early books that I've read were all in translation, so I can't imagine, not having access to them. But okay, I think we are almost out of time. I have one last question. That's I'm guessing just to satisfy my own curiosity, because it's something I constantly think about. When I'm picking up a book, I've read books that have been translated once, twice, thrice. Very recently I was reading The Odyssey, which was, I think, translated the first time by Emily Wilson, first woman translator. So I just want to know, do you think there can ever be a definitive translation of a book? And second, what changes in the text every time you translate it? Something like The Odyssey, when I was reading it, a lot of the reason that coverage happened, around Emily Wilson's translation, was because they were talking about how she brought in the feminist perspective, she brought in the gendered perspective, which was lacking completely when it was being translated by men. So the definitive version, and also, is the source text changing every time it's translated? Are new meanings, are new ideas being sort of springing up within the text every time it goes through another round, another translator? So either of you, I think. Arunava, Prisca, someone.
Prisca, you go first.
Okay. I don't think that there is a definitive translation. I don't think so, because society changes all the time, and perspective, society around us changes all the time, and perspective, the way we look at society changes. I mean, look at the example that Arunava told us. I mean, when a society is under colonization, you look at your own society in a way, or maybe you can't look it differently because of many forces around you, you know. So imagine a translator who lives under a government who doesn't allow you to say some words, use some words. Imagine a translator who finally can do that 10 years later. I mean, I think the perspective changes, society changes. So, and it is also funny to imagine that an ancient text will always renew itself. I think it's beautiful to imagine that we have a book written in the Greek time that we can read it today in another perspective. In how can I say, drownings, and like comics. Sorry, but you can change the perspective and renew the book. It is alive. I mean, you keep a book alive. So I think it's very. I think definitely we don't have a final version of a text. I hope we won't have.
Arunava, what do you think?
No, I mean, Prisca said everything that I would have. There absolutely cannot be a definitive version. In fact, great books need newer and newer versions all the time. New societies, new times, and you will read great books in new ways. A post-environmental society is definitely going to read the classics in a very different way, right? We're going to read them for other things altogether. And you know, I'm always reminded of Borges' famous story, the man Pierre Menard, the man who rewrote Don Quixote. So in that story, you know, Pierre Menard rewrote Don Quixote in Spanish word for word, exactly using exactly the same words. And in the commentary, Borges pointed out that whereas these words meant this when Cervantes wrote them, the same words mean this when Pierre Menard wrote them 400 years later. So you see, if the same words can mean completely different things depending on who's reading them and when, there cannot be a definitive version.
I think that's a great note to end on, to reading new great books over and over again in new ways. And I mean, thank you so much, Arunava and Prisca, for that conversation. I think we covered a lot of ground, and this was lovely. Great readings from both of you. Thank you so much for that. And I'd like to take a moment to thank Belong and thank Pro Helvetia for putting us together on this Zoom window. So that's all for today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for this great question, Swati. And it was lovely listening to you, Prisca. And I really envy you. You know 4 languages. At least four. Maybe there.
At least 4. I also envy your. How many did you say that you have in India?
We have. You can't count.
I envy your uncountable languages. Thank you, and sorry for my English.
So yes.
Thank you.